At my wedding rehearsal, my parents demanded I remove Grandpa from the head table because he's just a retired janitor. They had no idea his secret would change everything before the reception ended. The night before my wedding was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life. Instead, it became the night my family finally showed me who they really were. My name is Emily Carter. I was 29 years old, a successful architect living in Chicago, and I believed I came from a respectable family. At least, that's what I used to believe. If someone had asked me who my hero was, I wouldn't have mentioned a celebrity or a billionaire. I would have smiled and answered one name. My grandfather, Walter Carter. To the rest of the world, he was simply an old retired janitor who had spent 43 years cleaning the hallways of Lincoln High School. He never wore expensive suits. He never drove luxury cars. His house was tiny. His clothes were simple. His hands were rough from decades of honest work. People looked at him and saw an ordinary old man. I looked at him and saw the person who had practically raised me. When my parents were too busy chasing promotions and social status, Grandpa was the one who packed my school lunches. He attended every soccer game. He helped with every science project. He taught me how to ride a bicycle. When I failed my driver's test, he reminded me failure wasn't permanent. When my first boyfriend cheated on me, he sat beside me on the porch for 3 hours without saying much. Sometimes love doesn't need speeches. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to stay. Grandpa always stayed. He lost Grandma when I was 12. He never remarried. He said one great love was enough for one lifetime. He kept her wedding ring in his wallet until the day she died. Every Sunday he polished it before putting it back. That's the kind of man he was. Meanwhile, my parents slowly became people I barely recognized. My father, Richard Carter, climbed the corporate ladder until he became senior vice president at one of Chicago's largest financial companies. My mother, Diane, reinvented herself as someone obsessed with appearances. Country clubs, luxury vacations, designer handbags, private charity galas where rich people congratulated each other for donating money while waiters quietly cleaned up after them. Somewhere along the way, they began treating people according to their job titles instead of their character. I noticed it years before my wedding. Dad would tip expensive restaurants generously because important clients were watching. But he'd barely acknowledge the parking attendants. Mom remembered every wealthy neighbor's birthday. She couldn't remember the first name of the woman who cleaned her house every Thursday. I hated it. Grandpa hated it even more. But he never criticized them. He simply lived differently. He always said, "Emily, never measure someone's worth by the clothes they're wearing. Measure them by how they treat people who can't do anything for them." Those words stayed with me. They became the foundation of who I wanted to become. Then I met Daniel. Kind, patient, funny. Unlike many people in my parents' social circle, he cared more about family than status. One afternoon I introduced him to Grandpa. They spent 4 hours talking in Grandpa's garage while repairing an old lawnmower. Afterward, Daniel hugged me and whispered, "I understand why you're such a good person now." He wasn't talking about my parents. He was talking about Grandpa. The proposal happened exactly 1 year later. The first person I called wasn't Mom. It wasn't Dad. It was Grandpa. His voice cracked with happiness. "I've been waiting for this call." He cried. I cried. It remains one of my favorite memories. When we started planning the wedding, there was never any question where Grandpa would sit. Right beside us. At the head table. Because without him, there probably wouldn't even be a wedding. He had quietly paid part of my college tuition years earlier. I didn't even know until after graduation. He sold his classic pickup truck to help me finish school. When I confronted him, he simply shrugged. "You needed a future more than I needed another truck." That's who Walter Carter was. The rehearsal dinner took place at an elegant downtown hotel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Fresh white roses decorated every table. Soft piano music echoed through the ballroom. Everything looked perfect. Until my mother noticed the seating chart. She stared at it for several seconds, then looked at me. "Emily." I smiled. "What?" Her smile disappeared. "Why is your grandfather sitting at the head table?" I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Dad walked over. His face looked unusually serious. We've been meaning to discuss this. My stomach tightened. Discuss what? Dad lowered his voice. My CEO is attending tomorrow. So, there will also be board members. And Mom sighed dramatically. Honey, your grandfather doesn't exactly fit the image. I blinked. I'm sorry. She pointed toward the seating chart. He was a janitor. I stared at her. So, Dad folded his arms. It may create the wrong impression. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Wrong impression of what? Mom looked genuinely confused why I didn't understand. Our family. Silence. Then she said the sentence I'll never forget. He's a retired janitor. He embarrasses us. The room seemed to stop moving. I looked around hoping someone else would react. Nobody spoke. My younger brother looked at the floor. My aunt pretended to check her phone. Several relatives simply stayed quiet. Because silence is easier than courage. I asked slowly, You want me to remove Grandpa from the head table? Dad nodded. He can sit with the other relatives. Absolutely not. Mom's voice became sharper. Emily, don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic. Dad crossed his arms. We're paying for part of this wedding. Daniel finally stepped forward. And Dad looked surprised. Daniel calmly replied, That doesn't buy you the right to insult the man who practically raised Emily. My father ignored him. He looked directly at me. Make the change. No. Emily. No. Mom whispered angrily. You're choosing a janitor over your parents. I answered without hesitation. No. I'm choosing the only person in this family who taught me what dignity looks like. The ballroom became completely silent. Mom grabbed her purse. Dad's face turned bright red. If he sits at that table. He paused. We won't attend. I looked at him. For the first time in my life. I didn't feel afraid. I simply answered. I'm going to miss you. They expected me to beg. To apologize. To compromise. Instead, I walked away. A few minutes later, I found Grandpa standing alone near the hallway. He had heard everything. His eyes looked tired. I'm sorry, sweetheart. My heart broke. For what? I don't want to cause problems. You didn't. He smiled sadly. Maybe I should stay home tomorrow. I grabbed both of his hands. If you don't come, I won't have a wedding. He looked at me for a long moment. Then nodded. The next morning, my parents kept their promise. They didn't come. Neither did several relatives who sided with them. People whispered. Guests wondered what happened. But once the ceremony began, none of it mattered. Because Grandpa walked me halfway down the aisle before Daniel took my hand. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the ceremony, everyone moved into the reception hall. The atmosphere slowly became joyful again. Then something unexpected happened. Dad's CEO arrived. His name was Jonathan Pierce, one of the most respected executives in the country. The room naturally grew quieter. People assumed he'd congratulate the bride and groom. Instead, he stopped walking. His eyes locked onto Grandpa. For a second he looked confused, then shocked, then emotional. Without saying another word, the powerful CEO crossed the ballroom straight toward Walter Carter. Everyone watched, including the guests who knew my parents had walked out. Jonathan stood in front of Grandpa. His voice trembled. He smiled and said only 4 words. You saved my life. The room fell completely silent. Grandpa looked stunned. Jonathan continued speaking. 35 years earlier, he had been a frightened 17-year-old student. Homeless. Hungry. Ready to quit school forever. Working nights while trying to graduate. One winter evening, he collapsed inside Lincoln High after staying awake for nearly 2 days. Most people walked past him. The school janitor didn't. Walter Carter sat beside him, bought him dinner, found him temporary shelter through a local church, and secretly paid for his graduation fees using money he'd been saving for a family vacation. Jonathan never forgot. That single act of kindness kept him in school. He earned a scholarship, finished college, built a career, eventually became CEO of the very company where my father worked. He had searched for Walter for years but never found him after the old school closed. Now fate had brought them together at my wedding. Jonathan turned toward the crowd and said, "If this man hadn't believed in a poor kid everyone else ignored, I wouldn't be standing here today." Then he hugged Grandpa. Not a polite handshake. A genuine, tearful embrace. Guests applauded. Some wiped away tears. Then Jonathan looked around. "Where are Richard and Diane?" No one answered immediately. Finally, someone quietly explained why they weren't there. Jonathan's expression changed. He didn't raise his voice. He simply shook his head in disappointment. "I've spent my entire career looking for leaders with integrity." He looked toward Grandpa. "I found one decades ago." Then he added, "Job titles don't make people honorable. Character does." Word spread through the ballroom within minutes. By the following Monday, everyone at my father's company knew exactly why he had missed his daughter's wedding. Not because of illness. Not because of travel. Because he refused to sit beside the man who had once cleaned school floors. His reputation never fully recovered. People didn't remember his position. They remembered his choice. Meanwhile, Grandpa never bragged about what happened. When reporters from a local newspaper wanted to interview him after guests shared the story online, he politely declined. He said, "I did. And save anyone. I just helped a kid who needed someone." That was Walter. Always humble. Always kind. Years later, when Daniel and I welcomed our first daughter into the world, we gave her the middle name Walter, slightly adapted as Willa, to honor the man who taught us that greatness has nothing to do with wealth, status, or prestige. Every anniversary, we leave flowers at Grandpa's grave and tell our children the same lesson he taught me. Never judge a person by the uniform they wear. The person quietly sweeping the floor today may be the reason someone powerful is standing tomorrow. And the people who measure worth by status often discover, sooner or later, that respect cannot be bought. It can only be earned through kindness. That was the real inheritance Grandpa left behind. Not money. Not property. Not influence. Just an example of a life lived with humility, dignity, compassion, and quiet strength. And in the end, that proved to be worth far more than anything my parents ever spent a lifetime trying to impress the world with.